If you lived in Canada, then you know that there's a lot of countryside out here, along with forests. Most of the abandoned buildings you might come across are found there. I was 16 when this happened. I grew up mostly in the rougher part of the capital. Yes, even Ottawa has its tough spots, and one is known as Vanier. While it's no Detroit, it's still where most of the poor, along with other drug addicts and homeless, live and stay. I've been through plenty of stuff that a lot of people would say is scary, but this is something that still to this day, at 21 years of age, does not sit well with me. I was with my buddies at a warehouse of sorts. It was pretty deep in the forest. We were drinking and talking when one of my friends brought up the old story of a haunted farm near that spot. He went on about how the guy who got him in brought him there to scare the crap out of him. I want to add that when they went, he did confirm that his friend was the one who was messing with him, but he still said that something was off about it, so we started making jokes. And then I made a joke that got him really serious. I think I said something along the lines of, "There's a ghost in there with Betty White making a porno." He then looks me in the eyes and tells me, "No, something is messed up in there. I don't care what, but I felt it." Me being the jerk that I am, I joked about how he was being a wuss and that the only things you really have to fear is fear itself. He then convinced me to go to this haunted barn. In retrospect, I should have just shut up right there and then. Next thing I know, we're heading to the barn. We get there, and it's me, my friend, plus this guy that I don't really know, but he was with the group. We walk in, the three of us. Me and the other guy start loudmouthing, right? Wild stuff like, "Hey Casper, what's poppin'?" and "First spirit that comes out gets bopped on sight." I'm not joking when I say that we get halfway in when these heavy doors shut on us. Those big barn doors, the old ones that took some effort getting them open in the first place, let alone having them swing closed like that. We go to push them open only to find out that they were stuck. So we immediately turn to my friend and start grilling him over trying to trip us up over some fake ghost crap, while Random that was with me starts turning on his flashlight on his phone. I'm asking where our mutual friend is, who I thought was helping him, until I noticed my friend is straight tearing up, which causes me to start freaking out. And I mean freaking out. I'm banging on the door, trying to get homeboy to help, while big homie is acting like a statue. I get a weird feeling on my shoulder. I start to freeze up, and all I hear to my side is "scared," as if it were some kind of taunt. I spin around, seeing the same scene as from when I had started freaking. The guy pushing on the door, my friend staring off into nothing. As I'm asking if anyone heard that, the guy pushing the door starts spazzing, saying something in Spanish, I think. I grab him, telling him to calm down, while he's giving me this look like he just got shot. I'm sitting there trying to snap him out of his funk. Then my friend starts ramming into the door over and over really hard. I thought he was going to hurt himself. It was dark. I can't tell exactly what was being thrown around, but I can tell you that a lot was going through the air. We just started hearing crashes from all sides. I even got hit with something. I still have a scar to this day on the left side of my chin and my left shoulder. Then, the screaming. It was like 3 chicks were getting cut up. It was awful. I won't lie, I'm not going to act tougher than I am. I started passing out for the first time, being the most bizarre feeling. My friend grabs me and the random guy, both of us not seeing that he did get the door open. When we got out, I threw up, while the random dude said something that I didn't catch and then just took off. My friend and I looked at each other and started walking back. The entire way he was explaining that he had no part in this. He kept swearing it up and down. I kept ranting about how that this was impossible, and that there was no lock on the door, so how was it even locked? And that caused him to freak out more. I had to go to the doctor to get stitches for whatever it was that flew into me while we were in there. When I told the doctors what happened, which I had to say what happened, But really, I should have just made something up, because it could have been anything. And when I told them what did happen, they looked at me as if I were crazy upon my explanation. They actually made me go and see a shrink for a bit, due to my outlandish claims. After a while, they let me off the hook, thinking that I wasn't crazy. All I know is that I was sober that night. Last time I checked, 2 beers don't make you trip out. And random dude is refusing to tell us why he was screaming. Now, for a bit of comparison, when I was 15, I had a shotgun pointed at me and then pressed into my stomach, being threatened that they would pull the trigger. But that's simple. I'm about to get blown up, and that's gun plus angry dude equals body. But that night, I could not explain, nor could I control, or fight back. That night fills me with a terror that has changed my life. And I see how rooms and dark places that I didn't know what was happening or how to react to or defend are the reasons to this day that this was one of the most horrifying experiences I have ever had. Don't get me wrong, getting a gun pointed at me got me on the path where I'm trying to change my life. But I can't change not being able to walk in the dark around my house and my refusal to be in dark rooms. This story is from 2013. I travel a lot for work. Before COVID. And when I do, I stay at hotels. Sleeping in a different bed doesn't bother me, as I'm mostly a sound sleeper, and I'm used to it given that I've been doing this for a while. This was a hotel in the suburbs of Chicago. From the time I checked into the room, I think it was room number 413, I have never felt such a sense of dread, despair, and claustrophobia. I am a rational person, no history of depression or mental illness, so I explained it to myself that maybe the 13 in the room number was messing with my head. But I've stayed in other hotel rooms with a 13 in my assigned room number. I had also stayed at this same property every week over the last few months, but I had never felt this way. I pondered while lying in bed if I should call the front desk and ask for another room. I didn't know what excuse that I would give to them. Everything was great with the room. The shower was fine, the room was spotless, the toilet had no issues. It was a boring, predictable, clinically consistent room like any other Marriott property. No complaints on the Wi-Fi. I couldn't bring myself to lie to the front desk and ask to be changed to another room. So I told myself I was a rational man, a husband, a father, and a protector. I decided that I was going to stay put. The uneasiness didn't lessen, so I turned on every light in the room, took out all the Bibles from the bedstands, and set them next to me. I am not of the Christian faith, and not very religious either, but I felt like I needed all the protection I could get. So I played chants on loop on YouTube from my own religion all night at low volume until I went to sleep. I woke up in the morning, worked out, showered, and went to work. The night's experience felt like a fleeting memory during the day. I had a really fun rental that week, a Mustang GT, and it was so much fun the night's memory almost felt imaginary entirely. I came back from work that evening feeling a little silly about the night before and went back to the room. In an instant, the same sense of unexplained dread and claustrophobia came flooding back. I just couldn't rationally explain it. So I went back to the routine from the night before. Lights on, chanting, Bible, Marriott Mormon Bible, all by the bed. Next evening, I spoke with the bartender and asked him if he had heard any weird complaints. He said he hadn't, but he'd ask around. When I came back the next week, I got a different room, but I checked in with the bartender. He said he had done a little digging over the weekend and picked up on gossip from the other hotel staff that some of the cleaning ladies didn't like that room and even that corner of the 4th floor. He was intrigued enough that he brought along a sensitive friend of his from his Episcopalian church and said that when she opened the door and had barely taken a step inside that she just made a 180-degree turn and came right back out. She couldn't even go inside and said that it felt heavy. The bartender said that it was enough to spook him. He said he just stood in the corridor and refused to go in after that. We kinda had a laugh about it and figured that we would Google the property address to see if there were documented murders or suicides, but there was nothing. The property changed hands a few times. There was a nearby fire with some deaths, but nothing notable as far as Google search goes. I didn't think much of it, but I have stayed more than 2,000 nights in hotels since the fall of 2013, and I have yet to experience that fear ever. I continue to rethink about the memory of my experience, trying to recount the details about the room, the week, maybe the mood at work, just so I could find something rational to explain what I had felt, and I have been unable to. This experience left me pretty shaken up for a while. To begin, I was a fairly depressed and antisocial 15-year-old in high school, and on weekends I'd go and stay with my older sister in her apartment to get away from my parents and finally just relax. During this time, I'd gotten into studying astral projection, and I'd always been interested in the paranormal, as my mom and I had experienced things in our house, and my mom claimed that she could see the spirits. Anyway, one day after some reading, I decided to take the bus over to Toys R Us, where they still to this day sell Ouija boards to kids. I bought one of the silly glow-in-the-dark ones. My sister and I were really excited to start using it. Within a few minutes of putting our hands on the planchette, it began moving in a circle. Our first introduction was a little girl named Sarah. We end up chatting with this little spirit all night. Then, it turns into every single weekend. We begin to feel almost addicted to the board, always going to chat with Sarah. It was a long time ago, but I remember her saying that she was from the 1800s. She'd be so excited to talk every time we showed up. The planchette would spin in circles all over the board. We could even take our hands off of it, and it would continue to move. The addiction to the board goes on for months. Finally, one day we decide to ask Sarah to physically show us that she exists. We ask for a sign, and a strong breeze shoots straight into my ear so hard that I jumped back from the board. There was no AC on, no windows open, and no fans in the room. From here on, things get odd, and Sarah says that she is attached to me. I started getting an off feeling, and I ask, "Are you really Sarah, or are you someone else? Some of the things you say are pretty adult for a young girl." Then the planchette began to playfully spin all over the place, ending on "no." I feel a sense of almost maniacal laughter in the air. It's hard to explain, but my sister feels it too. Turns out Sarah was actually a man named Solomon. Solomon said that he loved me and that he was going to follow me. From there, we were freaked out and decided to stop using the board, but the pull was strong, and it legitimately feels as if it were an addiction. After this incident, I can almost always feel someone watching me when I'm alone. I'd see the shape of a man in my head, and the dark windows at night, but just for a second, enough to make me think I was losing my mind. I was frequently exploring church with my sister and was so scared from seeing figures pass by the windows and from feeling someone standing behind me that I told the preacher about our Ouija board use. He said he would pray and that I would have to ignore the spirit. Not the greatest advice. A month later, I had an odd and terrifying dream. Suddenly I'm above my body and in the den in my parents' house where I'd fallen asleep on the couch late at night. I look down at myself and then feel a presence by my body's head behind the couch near the hallway. There is a man standing there. He's wearing a black leather jacket, fitted, vintage-looking jeans, dark boots, kind of 40s, 50s-ish biker style. He was probably in his mid-20s. He had pale skin, dark, short-cut hair, and totally black eyes. He's almost attractive, if he weren't terrifying. He smiles at me eerily, and at light speed jumps for my body. I panic and jump too, trying to get back into my body before he does. I wake up in a panic, sweating and shaking. Somehow I eventually fall asleep at first light. And then when I awaken in the late afternoon, my mom tells me that she woke up to use the bathroom at night and fell to the ground in the living room having a seizure. I didn't know what to do or say. I was shocked. Could it have been from the paranormal encounter? Because she's a sensitive too? She used antidepressants frequently and switched them around a lot. But what a strange coincidence for it to happen that night. After that incident, life just continued on. So much of my teenage life felt negative at that age already that I just kept trekking forward, feeling someone behind me on some days not. The energy in my family's home was generally bad. Parents fighting constantly, father using drugs, mom in different phases of her bipolar. Definitely some energy a bad spirit or two could feed on. Fast forward to sophomore year in high school. I used to sit in the corner in band doing homework quietly, and one day a girl known as the school witch comes up to me. We'd maybe talked a few times, but didn't know each other very well. She simply states, "So there's a man following you, a spirit. I'm going to do a spell for you tonight to make him leave." Once again shocked, I tell her that there has been someone following me. She nods like, yes, obviously, then walks away before I can say anything else. By junior year, I'm dating a boy who lost his brother to suicide only months before we'd met. One night he calls in a panic and states that he was brutally attacked by a male spirit or demon in a dreamlike yet awake state. He said he felt someone sitting on him and could see a black spirit in the room. He called his brother's spirit to save him. He claims he felt a whoosh of energy and that his brother pushed the spirit off of his chest. He woke up really scared, saying that he'd never felt anything like it, and that he'd never had negative spirit encounters before, except as a small child. What scares me is that he'd randomly have episodes after this that made him not in his right mind, or almost mad. At the time, I'd felt and seen his brother's spirit twice, and it was never a hostile feeling. I felt somewhat protected while dating him because of this, but Solomon's negative spirit was something I still worried about and felt on occasion. Years go by, and I eventually become best friends with a girl whose family ghost hunts. We ghost hunt together, experience some creepy stuff, and I become less fearful. 2 years into our relationship, I get the courage to tell her psychic aunt my story, and she seeks to find out more about this spirit. She connects with him and laughs some. He's 5150, hun. He's absolutely mad. He's not necessarily evil, but he attached himself to you because he likes how easily he can scare you. He doesn't necessarily want to hurt you, but your fear gives him pleasure. In life, it seems, he was quite mentally ill. I was absolutely stunned. It all made so much sense, and how would she know this? After the talk, my best friend and her aunt tell him to F off, and to imagine a white light and to let him know he's not welcome. This seems forward, but one night I feel the presence and it angers me. Years of someone just wanting to scare me. I yell at the empty room that I'm not afraid of him and that he's not welcome. I use sage, imagine white light, and yell for him to leave. I feel a stir in the energy, almost like he's not even that angry to leave. It felt more like an annoyance at losing his fear target. From that point on, I've had the upper hand. There was one more experience with him one day at 25 while in a toxic living situation. This was 6 years after the experience with my friend's aunt. I left my body again and was excited. Finally, astral projecting as an adult. I sit up, and lo and behold, there he is, standing by the bed. But this time I shoot white light at him. He's gone in an instant. Then my toxic roommate at the time walks through the wall to grab me. I wake up. Was he trying to warn me? Does he still visit me? Can I ever make him leave for good? Sometimes I wonder if he ever felt compassion for me. It was all so strange, and I frequently meditate and banish negative spirits or energy from around me. I've shut down a lot spiritually because of these incidents. I constantly state that nothing is allowed to bother me, but I wonder if somehow he'll be there forever. It worries me sometimes, especially because he'd stated on the board that he didn't want anyone to have me. I feel confident that spiritually I am strong, but I've always wondered if there was some deeper level of banishing that I could have, or should have done, or could still do. Anyway, I wanted to share this story because it's been both such a weight and a mystery to me for so many years. I don't know what I believe anymore. Sometimes I wonder if my extremely negative state of mind drew him to my depressed teenage self. Maybe somehow I created this negative entity? I doubt that one, but it is still possible. I feel in a much better place mentally, physically, and spiritually now, so I don't feel threatened by spirits, or really believe that he is around anymore. But who knows? I sage and cleanse my place almost daily and feel it to be a safe and light space. I will say that there is still so much I don't know when it comes to all of those incidents. I, a 23-year-old female, just wanted to share what I would call my first real encounter. Even as a lifelong skeptic, I can't explain this. If you're familiar with U.S. ghost hunting spots, you might have heard of the Copper Queen Hotel in Bisbee, Arizona. It has been open since 1902 and has been the subject of multiple paranormal investigations and shows, and there are supposedly 3 documented ghosts who inhabit it. That of a drowned child, a man in a top hat, and a forlorn prostitute. My boyfriend and I decided on Saturday morning that we would take a trip to make up for a missed birthday. We had never gone on a real trip together, so we didn't plan it well at all. We just realized that we were about an hour and a half from Bisbee and decided to book a hotel once we got there. We chose the Copper Queen because it was the most prominent hotel in the area and is right in the middle of everything. We weren't aware of its reputation as a paranormal hotspot. The room itself was antique-looking, as expected with a hotel that old. Yellowing wallpaper, splintering wood floors, dim lighting. The locks on the door were pretty flimsy, and you had to actively yank it shut or it would fall open again. We joked that it looked like the Tower of Terror. After a day of walking around, we came back to get changed. We heard a creaking noise, and I had Coop check under the bed, only half seriously, but I was still relieved that nobody was there. We grabbed a lighter and went out for a smoke, then came back, showered, watched TV for a little while, and then turned out the lights. The moment that we shut the lights off, there was a variety of clicks, creaks, and pops in odd patterns. It being an old room, and us being a logical couple, we figured that it was the old fan or the wall-mounted AC. I was just listening to the noises when I felt Coop freeze up next to me. "Is that you?" I responded no, that it was the AC. "Not that. Seriously, is that you?" I asked him what he meant and waited for a minute or so before asking again, and again. Finally, he answered. "I was trying to listen, babe. I hear someone breathing." We reasoned that it was the room next door and settled back into our pillows, and then I remembered that there wasn't another room on that side. Our room was the first on the landing, and the side that we were closest to, the side that Coop would have been able to hear, if at all, was the main staircase. Coop, being a 21-year-old boy, is blessed with the ability to fall asleep within seconds. I could hear him snoring, and his legs were over mine, but I was too anxious to sleep. I then felt the lightest tap on top of the quilt just next to my feet. I froze, but tried to reason with myself that Coop had just twitched in his sleep, although his legs were still on top of mine. A few moments passed and I thought that I had imagined it, and then I felt a pinch/tugging motion at the same area of the quilt. I woke up Coop and demanded that he check under the bed again. I was still reasoning that there was a non-supernatural explanation for the events, and it occurred to me that although we had checked before leaving our walk, we hadn't checked after. The flimsy lock and the fact that the door was difficult to close made it seem likely that someone could have snuck in. Coop was too groggy to be useful, so I grabbed my phone, turned the flashlight on, and leapt as far from the bed as I could while crouching to check what was under it. Nothing. We were both a little freaked out by this point and agreed to turn the TV back on to drown out any weird noises. We turned on Futurama and settled back into bed for the third time. Again, Coop fell asleep within seconds. I was drifting off when I heard the audio on the TV kind of cut somehow. It suddenly shifted tone to where it sounded like a grainy VHS instead of a streaming adult cartoon. I heard a woman saying something about a phantom, and then a blood-curdling scream from the TV. At this point, I was too scared to open my eyes, so I steadied my breathing and pretended to be asleep. That's the last event that I could recall, and upon checking out the next day, the manager asked if we had experienced anything. That's when we Googled the hotel and found out its history of hauntings. So there it is. Nothing too crazy compared to other posts here, but I have definitely never experienced anything like that before and don't have an explanation besides the paranormal. I believe in the paranormal, but I will go out of my way to weigh out every logical explanation that I can possibly think of before assuming that something is paranormal. I've told myself that this is sleep paralysis to make myself feel better, but it was such an odd encounter. I was 14 at the time that this occurred. I'm now in my late 20s. And I was really into gothic stuff, witchcraft, spooky shit, etc. I had a friend who had a Ouija board and wanted to come spend the night and play with it. Of course, I jumped on the idea, so she came right over. As I predicted, absolutely nothing happened. Though at one point the piece did slide off of the board, but we ended up blaming each other. I'm still pretty sure it was her. After a while, as I said, we got bored, and we gave up and went to sleep. About a week later, I came home from school and felt tired, which was abnormal for me because I'd normally throw my backpack down and immediately go outside, but I decided that I would take a nap. No one was home except me. I went to bed and passed out immediately. I woke up and couldn't move, and panicked. I've never had sleep paralysis before, nor had I even heard of it. So needless to say, this was horrifying. I then levitated off of my bed and toward the middle of my room, where I began to rotate in a slow circle. I felt like I was screaming internally, yet no sound was coming out of me, and then I finally woke up. I bolted out of my room and stayed up for the rest of that day. My mom insisted that it was sleep paralysis, and reassured me that it happens to people sometimes, so I thought nothing of it, and moved on. About a month later, it happens again. At night this time. I floated toward the center of the room like before, and promptly from there was slammed against my upper walls and ceiling by some sort of force that I couldn't see. I could feel its hands on me though, and I could physically feel myself hitting the wall. I felt tingly as well, as if my soul might fly out of me. I don't know exactly how to describe this feeling. It was almost like I was vibrating. Like when your foot falls asleep, but the needle jab numbness feeling doesn't feel quite painful. It was strange. I thought it was just sleep paralysis and reminded myself that I was dreaming to try and calm down, and started sort of willing myself to wake up, if that makes sense. I woke up, put on some music, and went back to sleep, and slept fine. The next morning I got up for school and was absolutely covered in bruises. It literally looked as though someone had beaten me with a baseball bat. So I told my mom, who said that I had probably just thrashed around in my sleep. This wouldn't be possible though, because I slept on a very soft, queen-size mattress and I'm a small person. I even went around my bed to see if there's anything that I could have bumped into. There was nothing. She said maybe I had hit myself in my sleep, but there were bruises on my back and shoulders too, so it just didn't make sense. I tried to just brush it off, but by this point I was getting really paranoid. For the next few weeks I would have instances where I would start to fall asleep. My body would tingle like it did in the last experience, and I knew that if I let myself fall asleep that I would have the weird sleep paralysis again. So I would force myself awake and adjust my sleeping position and then try to fall asleep once more. I would do this repeatedly until I could finally drift off without this tingly sensation. This became a daily thing, but I was okay with that because I figured out how to basically avoid sleep paralysis and thought that the creepy dreams were over with. A couple of months go by with no incidents, and I had pretty much forgotten about it. By this point it never really crossed my mind anymore, but I would still have the tingly feeling from time to time. It was Saturday. My mom was out with friends, my siblings were visiting family, and I was home alone. I kept feeling very strongly like I was being watched, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid, and that it was nothing. This is where it gets weird. I'm sitting on my bed, wide awake, writing in my journal. It's about 9 p.m. or so. The radio is on full blast, and all of a sudden I'm snatched off of my bed while wide awake by this invisible thing. I start screaming, and it starts slamming me into walls again. Finally, after a few minutes, it stops, and I float back to the center of the room, where I slowly start spinning in circles mid-air, much like the first experience. Only this time I can see myself lying on my bed on my back, with my legs crossed as they were when I was sitting there, hyperventilating with my eyes open while some sort of figure sits next to me. It looked like it would be extremely tall if it stood up. It was skinny with a masculine-looking build. Think tall and very skinny but muscular man. It had shoulder-length wavy hair, though it was really more of just like a shadowy outline of hair. Its body was made up of swirling black smoke only, and I don't know how to explain this any better. This smoke was darker than just being black. Like, imagine if the color black could be darker than it already is. That's what that color was. I have literally never seen a color this dark anywhere else. It was like seeing a color that no one has ever seen. The thing had big yellow almond-shaped eyes and a tiny black pupil in the middle of each one, but I couldn't discern any facial features. It didn't move. It just sat there staring at me for what felt like hours. Finally, I jump awake, and I'm laying in a pool of sweat. I immediately start crying and flipping out because, like I said before, I did not fall asleep. I was wide awake and sitting up when this happened. I wasn't even thinking about sleep. I wasn't even tired. My pen was still in my hand, my radio was still up loud, and my legs were still crossed. Maybe I fainted, but that's never happened to me before. Thankfully, we moved shortly after that, and it never happened again, but to this day, the hair on my arms stands up when I remember this thing. I've read a lot about sleep paralysis demons and experiences, and nothing seems to quite match what happened to me. This happened to me when I was in high school. I was at my friend's house at the time, who lived in an apartment building. She had a neighbor who lived upstairs, and was a few years younger than us, who we hung out with when I visited my friend's apartment. On this specific day, my friend's neighbor mentioned that she had a Ouija board, and asked if we wanted to use it with her. We both agreed, as I personally didn't think Ouija boards were actually paranormal, and thought it was a myth. We went into a garage area of the apartment building and put our fingers on the planchette. For the first few hours, nothing really even happened. Eventually, we had movement on the planchette and started asking questions to this spirit, who would answer us. I forgot who, but someone asked if the spirit was trying to communicate with anyone. Interestingly enough, it spelled out my name. I was skeptical and thought it was one of my friends messing with me, so I asked what its name was. It then spelled out my grandmother's name, who died 6 months before this Ouija board encounter. I started getting a little uncomfortable, as my grandmother's name is in another language, and my friends did not know this language, nor have I ever told them what her name was. They wouldn't even know how to spell it either. Weirded out, I asked what my grandmother wanted. She started spelling out U-R-G-R, and then the planchette started going in weird circles, and even going off of the board, and wasn't spelling out anything that made sense. So I asked for further clarification, and then just "You are great" popped up. This will be important later, so keep that in mind. Anyway, at that point I thought it was just one of us moving it weirdly, so I said goodbye. A few days later, my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, suddenly passed away. It was unexpected, as he was in great health, and it was right before Christmas, and he was so excited for Christmas. As I was at his funeral, I remembered sitting there and thinking about the Ouija board, and that's when it hit me. When my grandmother initially tried to spell out something that started with G-R, I realized that grandfather starts with G-R. But then the planchette had moved around so weirdly when my grandmother couldn't spell out the rest of the word, as if something had been stopping my grandmother from completing the word and warning me. The next few months were hell, as I started blaming myself, and was convinced that I had somehow contributed to my grandfather's death by using this board. It got to the point that I became suicidal, and the scariest part is, my thoughts felt as if they were not my own. As if something were trying to lead me toward taking my life, as they were very dark. I can't explain it, as it could have been guilt. But I felt like something was watching me all the time and felt a strange presence in the next few months after using the board. There's also the fact that the night of when I used the Ouija board, I was in the bathroom and I was underneath some lights. I had a strange sensation and felt that I needed to walk away, but right when I did, the lights shattered and would have injured me if I had been standing underneath. I eventually confessed to my mother about the Ouija board experience, and right when I did, I felt a giant weight lift off of my shoulders. The negative and dark thoughts were slowly disappearing, and I started to not feel the dark presence anymore when I overcame these thoughts. However, I was still wondering if the spirit that I had contacted was even really my grandmother. I also wondered if I was imagining this dark presence and the dark thoughts that I had had. Fast forward, I was at an overnight event at my school and another friend brought a Ouija board. I decided to use it one more time with this friend and try to get some answers. At one point, the Ouija board said that it was trying to contact me specifically. When we asked who it was, it then started spelling out D-E-V. We started panicking, but then it spelled out to a word that I forgot. I dismissed it and thought it was nothing, but my friend decided to look up the word. A few weeks later, she told me that the word meant devil in another language. It was then confirmed to me that it may not have been my grandmother who was contacting me the first time. There is also the fact that there may have been something that was trying to get to me and did not have good intentions. To this day, I am convinced that this spirit only tried to warn me about my grandfather so that when he passed, I would have felt guilty. By feeling guilty, I was more vulnerable to the spirit's influences, to the point that I would almost take my own life. I do not know if this is what actually happened, but it's the only logical explanation that I have. When I was approximately 15 years old, circa 1988-89, myself and my family had 2 summer holidays in Portugal, one following on from the previous year. The first holiday included myself, my older sister, mom and dad, and an uncle and aunt. The second holiday the following summer was the same people, except my sister, who stayed at home. Both holidays were in the same location, and both times we stayed in the same villa, which was owned by a business associate of my uncle. As such, I believe the accommodation was free, and that's why it was such a great holiday option for us all. The villa was situated about a 15 minutes walk outside of a well-known town. The first holiday where my sister was also present was event-free, and nothing unexplained happened at all. The second holiday was where I alone experienced an absolutely terrifying paranormal event, which has stayed with me to this day. The villa we stayed in was on one level, as most villas are, and had a pretty standard layout. The main door at the front led straight into a kitchen, and that led into the main lounge area. Off to the left and the right of the main lounge were 2 ensuite bathrooms where my parents and uncle and aunt slept. I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge area, and out to the back of the property was a small swimming pool. From memory, it was a very nice, spacious villa, and probably worth quite a bit of money. Nothing happened for the entire 2-week period that we were there, except for the final night of the holiday. I often say thank God that we flew home the next morning, because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. On this final evening, everyone had just gone to bed and closed their doors, and I had just finished setting up my bed and finally turned out the lights and got under the covers. No longer than 30 seconds after getting into bed, I began to hear tapping on one of the walls. I laid there trying to guess what it might be, and just figured that it was probably one of my parents or uncle or aunt doing something in their rooms, so I ignored it. I then heard the same tapping again, but louder. I sat up in bed and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. This is how I know that it wasn't sleep paralysis, as some people have often suggested to me, because I was peering across the dimly lit lounge room. It was then that the tapping started to spin around the room, as if the knocking was circling me as I sat there. This was naturally pretty unnerving, and I struggled to rationalize what was taking place. It was at that point that the tapping stopped, and immediately a wooden chair from the lounge room dining table made a scraping sound against the wood parquet floor that it was resting on. The sort of scraping noise a chair would make if you pulled it out from under the table to sit on it. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and being as young as I was, I think fear got the better of me, and I shot down into the bed, turned around, and pulled the sheets up under my chin and closed my eyes. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Next, I heard more scraping as dining chairs were being moved, followed by a very quiet but very distinct shuffling noise, which sounded like shuffling footsteps. These footsteps got louder as whatever it was began to approach me in the room. As it approached, I then heard this mumbling in what sounded like guttural, low-key talking, but in a language that I didn't understand or recognize. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. On top of this mumbling, I suddenly began to hear this terrifying, rasping breathing in and out in a very rhythmic fashion, the sort of rasping that someone with severe breathing difficulty would make. This breathing got louder and louder until it was right behind me, right next to my head, on the pillow, rasping loudly into my right ear. Petrified doesn't even cut it. I was simply frozen with fear. I don't think I could have turned around, even if I had wanted to. This loud, heavy breathing continued for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably about 30 or 40 seconds, and then it slowly faded away, and the room was left in silence. I laid in the bed for about another hour, unable to sleep, and listening intently for anything else, but there was nothing. Eventually I fell asleep, probably through nervous exhaustion, and when I next woke up it was 6 a.m., and daylight filled the room, and I recall the sheer feeling of relief. The first thing I did was get up and looked at the dining table area, and sure enough, 2 chairs had been moved away from their normal resting positions. And not just by a small amount, but significantly so. I also checked the rest of the communal areas in the villa to see if any doors or windows had been left open, but there was nothing. When my family got up, I told them all about what had happened, and unfortunately I was met with mainly skepticism, which I found a little upsetting at the time. To be honest, I think the experience affected me to the degree where I probably needed to go get counseling to really process it and to help get over it. But of course nothing like that was available at the time. About 11 years ago, a group of friends and myself drove to Mineral Wells, Texas for a spontaneous midnight exploration of the long-abandoned and supposedly haunted Baker's Hotel. It was incredibly creepy inside. The place was pitch black and littered with old pieces of dusty, moldy furniture and decor from the 50s and 60s, whenever it was last operating. The first thing that freaked us out was that it sounded like the building was breathing. And loudly. Turned out it was just flooding in the basement that was echoing through the elevator shafts. Anyways, we started exploring everywhere. By the time we got to the 7th floor, we were a little disappointed that nothing weird had happened yet. The adrenaline was kinda wearing off. We started walking down this long hallway on the 7th floor, peeking into various rooms and peering around with our flashlights. All of a sudden we heard a door, coming from the end of the hallway we were moving toward, slowly open, and then slowly close. It was creaking very loudly, just like in a scary movie. It scared us, and we froze. We were close enough that our flashlights reached the door in question. It was some kind of small, weird door, framed inside of a larger, regular door. My friend wanted to turn around and leave. We thought maybe there was a homeless person in there, and they were trying to scare us off. Nonetheless, I convinced him to keep going because I had to go in the room now. We started walking slowly toward the door, all the while saying stuff out loud like, "We're just exploring, if someone's in there, we're just messing around," things like that. We were probably about 15-ish feet away when the door suddenly began opening again, eerily and slowly like before. However, this time, it slammed shut, right in front of our eyes. Again, we were scared frozen. Again, I insisted that we keep going. A minute or so later, we worked up the courage and just barged right in that door as fast as we could. What was in there? Absolutely nothing. There was no possible explanation for whatever had opened and closed and then slammed that door. There were no cracked windows allowing for the airflow from outside. There was nothing. We shut the door behind us and sat down in nervous disbelief, and then chain smoked a couple of cigarettes each. We finally left and actually went through the rest of the building. Myself and a few friends go on a road trip every summer to visit haunted places. In 2018, we stayed at a haunted hotel in the northeastern United States and had to sign a safety waiver just to stay there. It was a small country hotel, and the only other party had canceled, so we had the place to ourselves with our tour guide. We had a spirit box type of device, which I've been skeptical of, but we all carried on conversations. There was a moment where I heard my name through the box, when I had never said my name, and even said my full name. I prefer a shortened version. We spent a lot of time upstairs in a room where the quote-unquote ladies of the night would sleep, and I was prohibited from sitting on the bed by a spirit that was allegedly the ladies' bodyguard. I sat down only for a few seconds, and as soon as I stood, the bed lifted up and dropped, scaring the hell out of me, and at least one of my friends witnessed this. We went upstairs to an unfinished floor that was under renovation. There was an old ornate chair that was used by a notorious Irish mafia hitman that stayed at the hotel frequently. We went in a circle saying our names to see if the spirit, Joe, would let one of us sit in the chair. I said mine, and a light that we were using started to flicker like crazy. This is especially odd because I have red hair, and as far as I know, I was the only one in our group of Irish descent. Our guide asked if he was sure that he wanted me to sit there, and he replied, "F yeah," through the box. I took the invitation and sat in the chair, and oddly enough, I felt some kind of strange power surge through me. I eventually stood and thanked Joe, and from the spirit box I heard, "You're welcome." Later that night is when the real event happened. Our guide said, "Now, I don't normally do this, but since there are only 4 of you, I'd like to take you down to the morgue." It wasn't so much of a morgue, but it was stone walls and a dirt floor, and it was cold as hell. We were in a corner of the room when our guide said, "I don't want to scare you, but there's something standing right behind you." I saw a shadow on the wall, but it was cast by my friend B. That's when B moved to the side, and there was another shadow underneath his. It was taller than anyone in the room, and gave off an intimidating presence. I looked back, and saw no one standing in front of the light source, and when I looked back again, there was no shadow. I've always been skeptical, but believed in the supernatural to a degree. Believe me when I say that basement had something seriously dark down there. Something evil. I have never felt so vulnerable in my life. The whole night we felt like we were being watched, and could hear footsteps around the hotel. I'd love to go back and get some more evidence someday. I've done paranormal investigations for a few years now, but that one night stay at that hotel was enough to completely convince me. There is definitely something beyond death, and perhaps the most terrifying part? Not everything on that side is friendly. When I was 13, I fell in love with a guy who said that he was 17. His family was from Haiti. I was a tomboy back then, so I was just excited to have somebody, anybody, like me. We started a romance. I was with him until about 16. He always snuck me around, and I obviously hid him as well. My mom would kill me if she knew that I had a boyfriend at that age. I would cut school and sneak into his house to, well, you know. His grandma, who he lived with, always creeped me out. She was indigenous and wore long, African-looking dresses and hated me. She saw me a few times and would outwardly show, disgust. I never understood why. Fast forward. I was 16. My boyfriend was acting weird. I got suspicious when I received some prank phone calls. I asked to see his phone logs. Long story short, I called some weird numbers and found out that he was having relations with 12 to 13-year-olds. Still, even though he was with me. I was so angry at this point. He was 20-ish. So I went to the police. I don't know why. I just did. They looked him up and down and told me that he wasn't 20. He was actually 27 and had had former charges for statutory rape. They asked me to tell them where he worked. Turns out, he was a pedophile the entire time. No wonder his grandma was disgusted at me. I looked like a child, and she knew his age. He was arrested, and I was asked to testify. This is where the scary stuff happens, by the way, if you've made it this far. 1 week before testifying, I was sleeping in my bed. I had a full-sized bed against the wall. This is important because on the other side of that wall was my mom's room. As a child, I would knock on the wall when I got scared, and she would come and rescue me. That night, I was on my back when I woke up with sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I knew because I frantically tried to reach for the wall and couldn't. My limbs felt abnormally heavy and wouldn't budge. I felt serious pressure on my chest, although there was nothing on it, and then I saw it. On my left, standing or kneeling next to me, was what I would call or only describe as a demon. He didn't give me a violent vibe. What was terrifying is it was ominous. Smug, even. He looked male, dark skin, almost like a seaweed green. Texture was bumpy, rigid. I just remember extremely sharp features. Pointy nose, pointy head, pointy chin. Very triangular looking. One thing I absolutely cannot forget is the smile. He has an ear-to-ear grin, a confident and perverted smile. I was terrified, unable to scream, and then I felt it. He shoved his disgusting fingers down my throat. This is where it gets almost perverted. It was a vigorous motion. He enjoyed it. It hurt. I closed my eyes and didn't know what else to do but pray. I'm not even religious, and I just prayed and begged for help. I felt the pressure lift off of my body, and my mouth was suddenly clear. I was too scared to move or open my eyes, so I pretended to continue to sleep and ignored the taste of iron in my mouth. I woke up the next morning absolutely mortified. I couldn't speak. My throat felt as if I had swallowed glass. There was blood on my pillow and in my mouth. I ran to my mom. I tried to voice what had happened. She was scared for me, but told me that it was all a dream. I didn't testify. I was scared to speak, and my throat hurt. I was just so stressed with everything, I wanted nothing to do with anybody. He went to jail anyways, because at that point, it was the state against him, not me. Time passed. I grew terrified to sleep alone. I always felt like the demon was in my room. I never saw him again, but I felt his presence everywhere I went. I would sleep facing the door and pray before bed, always. I would hear it in my dreams, sometimes telling me, "I'm still here," mocking me as I would run down the stairs in my dream and my legs would grow heavy. I would try to get out of my house, and I had to fight my body to move in my dream. There was even a time when I was at an ex-boyfriend's house years later, and I was brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, felt the hairs on my body rise, and I had this insane panic knowing that the demon was there. He was literally hovering on me. I couldn't see him or smell him or anything, but I felt his presence. I ran to my ex's bed and asked him to sleep on top of me the entire night to protect me. I had never in my life broken down like that. I can't explain it. I just knew that the demon was there trying to break in again. So I was about 22 when I got a phone call from the pedophile ex. He found me and called to check on me. Despite him being sick, he did love me in his own way, I think. I don't know. I don't feel like digging into it. Point is, he found me and called. He thanked me for not testifying. He said it saved him more time in jail. I had to ask. I asked him if he knew anything about demons. I then told him what had happened and asked if he could do anything with it because I remember him telling me things about his grandma doing hoodoo. He was silent. Then he finally told me without many details that he didn't exactly know what his grandmother had done, but all he knew was that a few weeks before the trial, she had come to where he was living with another African-looking guy in very indigenous clothing and asked for a few of my things. He gave them my hairbrush with my hair on it and other trinkets that I had left behind. He told me they took it and left. He doesn't know anything else. I was livid. I never spoke to him again and changed my number. I'm 30 now. I'm still scared to sleep alone. I don't feel the demon anymore, however, but I still have PTSD. I am still scared to have the door closed in my room. I still think about it every night before bed. I pray before bed. Although I never saw him again, I still feel something heavy. Not as bad as that time with my ex years ago in the bathroom, but it's more of a subtle heaviness. 3 years ago at my last apartment, which I believe was haunted, I was always so terrified. I would have scary dreams, the type that happen in your bedroom so you're not really sure if it's a dream or if it's real because everything looks the same. I remember having the urge to run out of my apartment sometimes. Just run. I would be on the couch and I would feel that fight or flight feeling and just jet toward the door and stand in the hallway outside my apartment because I was terrified for no reason. Demons exist. I won't get into other small stories that I have now because they're really not major compared to this one. But I will also say, I think I have experienced angels as well. Small stuff like having lost things appear on my bed when I live alone, or being in a dangerous environment and having a sudden feeling of, I need to stop doing this now, after seeing 2 pillars of parallel fog. If there's anything to feel good about, it's believing at least in the theory of opposites. If there's evil, which we know that there is, then there has to be good as well. All this started when I was in middle school. I was young and stupid and seriously interested in the paranormal. I grew up in a religious home, and I am still religious. I have no explanation for what happened to me. I started experimenting with the paranormal with my friends. We thought it would be really cool to use a Ouija board. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then the board started to move. We asked all the normal stupid questions like, who's there, or is anyone here? It moved really slow and steady. I was sure that my friend was messing with me. I got spooked and we threw out the board. But that is not where this story ends. Moving forward, I started having really weird nightmares. I would consistently wake up at 3 a.m. or not be able to sleep at all. I was basically a zombie throughout my entire day. There was one time when I was at home alone on FaceTime when I heard my mom yell my name. I yelled back and didn't get a response. My friend then reminded me that I was home alone. I immediately checked my whole house and no one was there. She heard the voice too though, so it couldn't be explained. I continued hearing voices and knocks and was still unable to sleep. There was one time where I was in my room doing homework and someone pulled my hair so hard that my head actually yanked down. I got so spooked that I ran to my dad and told him what had happened. He obviously didn't really believe me. My brother started noticing weird things too, and that's when I got really uncomfortable. He and I were in my room, and I went to the bathroom. When I came out, his face was stone white. He claimed he saw a little girl run past my bedroom door. It couldn't have been me because I used the bathroom connected to my room. We don't have any other siblings. Another time I was on FaceTime again with a separate friend and I had my phone out in front of me when I walked into my bathroom. My friend asked, "What is that behind you?" And as soon as she said that, the lights shut off. I sprinted to my brother's room and of course nobody believed me again. The icing on the cake though was when I was asleep one night and I woke up suddenly. It was 3 a.m. again and I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. All I could see was a hooded figure in all black staring at me from the corner of my room. I couldn't see its eyes. I just knew that it was looking at me. It began to float toward me, and then pressed all of its weight on my chest. I couldn't talk or move. After silently crying for what felt like forever, I finally croaked out the word Jesus, and it fled from the room through my door. After that incident, I told my mom everything about the Ouija board and the experiences, and she finally believed me. She could see how scared that I truly was and knew that I couldn't be lying. She immediately got to work and blessed me and the house. I haven't had anything that terrifying happen to me since, and I no longer live in that home. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I logged them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radio my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. My first visit to this hospital was in 2018. After searching for the address for a while, I came across one that looked accurate enough and went on my way to that lost place with a friend of mine. We arrived, astonished by the size of the complex. I didn't do a lot of research before that. I just knew that it used to be a hospital and was built during World War II, and by the address, it seemed legit. On our way down from the parking lot to the lost place, our excitement was growing, but so was our anxiety for reasons that we just couldn't ascertain. We make our way onto the complex at the part where the main entrance was before, and the air felt really dense. My friend felt the same way, but we brushed it off as just being a bit nervous, just ourselves, and we started to walk past some buildings at the entrance, completely focused and being amazed. At some point, my pulse must have slowed down due to me being focused on trying to take in everything I was seeing, because I noticed that it increased in speed when we reached the buildings where I suspected that the patients would have been. It felt like there was strong electricity in the air that made me feel even more uneasy. That's when we heard a door slam behind us at one of the buildings. We, of course, completely froze. The sound came from a building that was pretty far away from us, and that sound was very loud. There was no wind at all that could have caused the heavy doors to slam like that. The trees weren't moving, nor did we hear anything else. Just one door that decided to slam shut on its own. We nervously chuckled and decided to move closer to the exit. I asked my friend if I should record this visit on my phone, and she agreed. We both turned on airplane mode and went on our way. Whether it was due to our anxiety, or us being too alert, or something actually being there, we would turn around or stop walking at the same time, asking the other if we had heard that sound. Sometimes the sounds behind us resembled soft footsteps. Other times we would hear silent whispers that we couldn't quite make out. At some point, I began to question my sanity, but I knew that there had to be something there to make such specific noises, loud enough that my friend would also hear them, as I did. As we were walking toward the actual exit, we stopped to look at one building and we heard a very, very loud bang behind us, making our walking become very determined as we made our way to the main street. The bang was accompanied by other sounds that we couldn't define back then. Fast forward and both of us are at my place. We grab individual headphones and start to listen to the recording. And boy, was that some weird stuff. We both enabled plane mode before I hit the record button, but there were so many disturbances in the recording, distinct sounds like someone coughing, whispers, with clear vowels, that we couldn't quite make out the full words to. A woman's voice going, shh, breathing, and bleeps. I have to admit that we were freaking out a lot. I was almost crying because I found it to be so chilling. The thing that baffled us the most was the loud bang that made us leave. I swear to you, it wasn't there. At all. Not the bang on the recording that startled us so much that made us leave the place, but silent sounds? You can hear us being startled and agreeing to leave immediately, but no bang could be heard on that recording, and it's still not there. I held my phone the exact same way that I had been since I started that recording. I didn't put my clothes against one mic. The mics weren't broken after a test recording that we did. So there should be a banging sound, but absolutely there is not. And I have no clue why that is the case. That hospital is a really special place. From later experiences there, I have come to possible conclusions as to what kind of paranormal things occur. Myself, my younger cousin, and a couple of friends stayed recently at one of the most haunted places in Texas and America. As a kid, I had heard stories of this old hotel and the dark history behind it. In recent years, a few paranormal shows showcased and did some investigations there. When I saw in our local news that the Magnolia Hotel was opening back up for visitors to stay the night, I was stoked. When you stay the night, you get 2 rooms, regardless of whether you're staying by yourself or you're bringing company. Also, you get the whole second story to yourself for you to investigate. There is a door that separates the hotel, updated, side and the haunted rooms side. To be fair, the rooms that you stay in are haunted as well. The entire hotel is haunted. Needless to say, I recorded so much activity on tape and in person in my own experiences. The findings I have will raise the hairs on your body. I was hearing voices, seeing shadows, hearing footsteps, showing the EVP sessions and hearing our names. I actually got touched twice, and the second time was so chilling. We were outside of this room that had a ton of activity. My friend had the dowsing rods. She asked if there was a spirit, and 3 times it pointed directly at me. She asked if the spirit was next to me. The rods said no. She asked if it was behind me, and they said yes. At that moment, I felt someone grab my right shoulder and slowly move their hand down my back. I got cold chills and felt tingling and numbing for a good few minutes. I am planning to go back very soon. I am a sensitive. I attract ghosts, and I go ghost hunting quite a bit. I have other experiences from several places that are extremely haunted here in Texas and in other states as well. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. I work at the front desk of a hotel, and within the last 6 months, we had a guest that passed away in one of our rooms. Because of this pandemic, my boss has blocked off the room, even after deep cleaning, just to be safe. Due to the hotel business not doing well, he also had a couple of rooms cut off from power, which means that none of the electronics are working for those rooms. Now, our hotel has 2 phones up at the front, one for external calls and the other specifically for internal lines, which are only connected to the phones in each guest room. I was having a quiet day during my shift alone. Business isn't running as normal, and all the housekeepers had left for the day, and the only staff there was the maintenance guy and I. I get an internal phone call from one of the rooms and answer it as I usually do, and it's just static noises, along with an occasional cut-in between, like the noise that you get when you unplug your headphones from a device. I didn't think anything of it at first, and thought that it was a guest accidentally calling the front desk, so I waited a little bit to hang up. Then I realized that the call was from the same room where the guest had passed away, and that there was no way a call could be made from that room because the phone was unplugged. I was a little bit spooked, so I asked the maintenance guy, who was just chilling in the back office, to go and check out the room and make sure that the power was still out. He comes back and sure enough the phone is still unplugged, and he even took a picture of it. He also has a log of what rooms have power, electronics, etc. We even checked the lobby cameras to make sure that no one had gone into the rooms, and there was nothing. No housekeepers went in or out of the room at all within the past week. Just as we were done checking the camera footage, I received another call from that same exact room. And this time it was silent for a good 10 seconds or so, and then the same static noise, but this time much louder. I hung up the phone so fast, a guest asked if everything was okay. I didn't tell her. I tried to think of every scientific possible way that this could have been an internal mistake, such as an outside sales call accidentally getting caught within our internal call system, but that's just impossible to begin with, especially if the phone cord was not plugged in. When I was in middle school, my mother and father did not live together. Eventually, we all moved into this apartment together in the local town. The local town is peaceful, calm, and barely any crime happens here. Obviously, when you're a kid, you can get scared of the dark and stuff like that. However, this wasn't just being afraid of what lurks in the darkness, because there was actually something watching me as I fell asleep. The first night I slept there, I just kept getting the feeling as if something was staring at me from the hallway. My bed was almost completely centered to where the door was, and my door was always open, so I would always be able to see what was outside. And I would just stare, always, down the hallway, thinking that something was looking back at me. It wasn't long after that before I started actually having paranormal encounters. The first paranormal encounter I ever had, one night I was sleeping in my bed. I remember feeling like something was watching me again, except this time I rolled over to see a large, black, shadowy man standing in my doorway. My eyes began to tear up, and I hid under my sheets, but this strange pressure came over my body. It was almost as if I couldn't breathe or talk. And then my ears would start ringing, and I would fall asleep with a snap of a finger. Then I would have this nightmare of my parents coming into my room slowly, coming over to my bedside table, and screaming at me. Their faces would just rot away into this deep, black shadow face, which I named Black Eyes. I would then wake up, usually in a completely different room, not knowing what I was doing. Sometimes I would be standing in the bathroom, or laying on the couch in the living room. A few times I would be standing over my parents' bed, just looking at them. This event reoccurred more times than I can even count. Then, finally, my family began to notice the figure as well. My mother at the time would have friends over and they would say something like, "Did you just see that man walk down your hallway?" She would see it too. The same thing that I saw that would stare at me and put me to sleep at night. There would be strange events around the apartment, such as the TV changing channels, random phone calls from unknown numbers in the middle of the night. One of the most random occurrences in the house would be the random, horrible smell of death coming from the bathroom. This happened about once a week at a random hour. Nobody could figure out why the bathroom would smell like rotting death, and no matter how hard my mother attempted to clean the bathroom, the smell would not go away until about 2 hours later. It would just randomly disappear, with no explanation as to what it could have been. Many people who came over would see this shadow figure. My father didn't want to believe it, as he didn't believe in ghosts, but my mother was fully prepared. She had lived in a haunted house before and wasn't surprised by what was happening. Nobody would act like they believed me when I tried to tell them what I was seeing and why I was sleepwalking at night, but in reality, I think my mother was scared. She didn't want to tell me, with me being a kid and all, that I was possibly being possessed by this shadow man and being forced to walk around the house at night. Then came one night when we had to call the police. There was music coming from downstairs around 1 to 2 a.m. We knew that the downstairs neighbors had just moved out of the apartment, but we were awoken by this church-type music. We informed the police, and they came down to the apartment only to find a locked door. They busted it down to find absolutely nothing but music on a track playing by itself in the middle of the room. We were informed of this, and that only created more of a mystery. It was evident by that point that there was something in that apartment. Something dark. Something that didn't have good intentions. Eventually, after a few years, we decided it was time to move out. We had gotten a puppy, and she was barking down the hallway at nothing, and one night a plate fell onto the ground from the cabinet. It was time to go. The final night in the apartment, my mother and I both awakened to a horrible noise of what sounded like a chainsaw destroying the kitchen cabinets. We both ran out to turn on the lights and find absolutely nothing. We both look at each other like, "Did you hear that?" But couldn't say anything, and went back to bed. It was completely terrifying. I'm not sure what we were dealing with at this apartment. I'd like to say that it was just a ghost, but it seemed powerful. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. So I found this old, abandoned, broken down house in the woods close to where I live. I've only lived here about a year. I was alone walking around it, trying to see if I could have a peek inside. While I was walking around and whatnot, I felt a bit scared, but I pressed on. I found a way in, but it smelled so much of mold that I just decided not to bother. Anyway, the point of the story. When I was about to leave, I felt this sensation of sadness wash over me. I stopped and turned around and looked at an open window of the house from about 10 meters away, and I swear that there was a woman who stood there being in pain from the state of her house. I stared and was almost about to cry for a few moments as I walked away, but then I stopped and looked back again. I almost felt drawn to the house, not wanting to leave. But as soon as I got away from it and was walking back home through the forest, the feeling of sadness left. On a side note, the day before I had walked through a part of the forest where a lot of trees had been cut down and a lot of branches and bark were scattered all over the ground. There I also felt such sadness, as if the trees themselves were crying. As I'm writing this, I realize that I sound kind of insane, but I have never really felt this way before, and I feel normal like one day later, like today. In 2001, I was big into ghost hunting. I was looking online for a haunted weekend road trip destination and came across the Jefferson Hotel in Jefferson, Texas. About the only thing it said was that room 19 was quote-unquote uninhabitable. Now that really piqued my interest, so I called them up and asked if it was true. The lady at the front desk laughed and just said no, we book that room all the time. So I reserved it. I was so excited, but didn't really think that anything would happen. I'd been to several supposedly haunted hotels and B&Bs and had no results. Now, I'm not sensitive like some people. I always hear people say, I felt like someone was watching me. I have no idea what that means. The only thing I noticed when I walked in the room was a faint, musky smell of an old-fashioned perfume. I set up a recorder in the room and headed out to explore the town. It was like going back in time. If you live in Texas and are looking for a road trip, I highly recommend Jefferson. When I got back to the room, I turned off the recorder and looked out its one window to see a large bust of Thomas Jefferson in the courtyard. I then sat down on the bed to relax and watch some TV. After a bit, something caused me to look back up at the window, and I saw something. A red smudge on the glass. I frowned and got up to see what it was. I hadn't noticed any red smudges earlier. I looked closely. It was more like a streak of red in a greasy substance of some sort. Then I noticed more streaks, and then more. I gradually began to realize that these were letters. My heart began to race as I backed up to take it all in. These streaks of red were spelling out, "Help me." I kind of just collapsed on the bed, my heart still racing. I knew without a doubt in my mind that those letters were not there 15 minutes earlier. I just sat in disbelief for about 5 minutes. Needless to say, there was not much sleep to be had that night. As I left the hotel the next morning, I was disappointed to see that there was no one behind the desk. I really needed to talk to someone. I left a note about the writing and said that I would call them on Monday. When I called, I told the woman who answered who I was, and she said, "Hold on just a moment." She put the housekeeping lady on the phone. I asked, "Did you see it?" She said, "Yes, I saw it." And then she said, "Just before you arrived, I raised the blinds and turned on the AC. There was no writing. And the strangest thing was when I attempted to clean it off. She said that it was like the letters had been engraved into the glass. I told her that I was freaked out, and she confirmed that she was too. By the way, on the way home I listened to the tape that I had had running in the room while I was gone. What I heard was the sound of the closet door angrily slamming several times and something shuffling around. But what really got to me was the sound of a woman sobbing. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? I have always been interested in the paranormal and going ghost hunting, as me and my friends called it. This story takes place on an October night in 2005. We had gathered at my dad's house for a party. We lived way out in the country, in an old farmhouse. We decided to drive up the road to an old cemetery because one of my friends showed up with a Ouija board. I said we weren't going to use it at my house, but I was game to use it somewhere else. About 6 of us piled into different vehicles and took off. When we got there, we set the Ouija board up on an old concrete barrier that surrounded the entrance of the cemetery. For context, the cemetery was set on a hill surrounded by cow pastures, fields, and trees. Across the road stood an old, white church. There were 2 security lights that lit the church area and the entrance to the cemetery. There was one more security light that lit the field next to the only house for about 2 miles. We all stood in a circle, planchette in the centers, hands all on it. My friend led the seance and asked if there was anything in the cemetery with us. At first nothing happened and we all stood still and quiet. Then the planchette slowly moved toward yes. Immediately we all started accusing each other of moving it, but everyone swore that they didn't. An eerie feeling fell over us as the planchette moved back to the center of the board. About that time, we heard what sounded like wind initially, but began to get closer. It sounded like the footsteps of multiple people running in circles all around us. We were all wide-eyed, looking at each other when someone said, "I'm out." Another person said, "We have to tell it bye or the spirits will follow." The leader of the group spoke to the board and said something along the lines of, "We are saying goodbye to you," and the planchette quickly jerked to no. It was pretty obvious by how shocked we all were that none of us had done that. Mind you, the sound of the footsteps are still surrounding us. The planchette moves to the center and we say bye again. Again, it moves to no, then back to the center. This time we all say it together, my friend's idea, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, moved the planchette to the word goodbye. We were relieved and took off running to the cars, which were parked at the entrance of the cemetery on the side of the road. Me and a buddy jump into my truck, and I hear my friend scream something about not being able to find their keys. She checks the ignition, her pockets. All our friends check the car and their pockets. No keys. Everyone else loads back into the truck, and we speed the 3 miles down the road to my dad's house. My friend searches her purse and pockets for the keys again, and again we couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, someone takes her home, and she says she'll get her spare and get a ride back to her car in the morning. We were all too scared to go back and look that night. The next day, my friend searches the cemetery and never finds the keys, even in broad daylight. We hadn't walked around a whole lot, and where we used the Ouija board was very close to where we had parked our cars. Me and several friends scoured the entire cemetery over the next week or so and never did find them. My friend said she was 100% positive that they were left in the ignition when she got out of the car. It's where I left mine, and a common practice in the area where I'm from, which, like I said, is pretty rural. This was by far my scariest, but not the only, Ouija board experience that I have. When I was younger, my parents had gotten divorced. My dad was an abusive alcoholic who drained my mom out of a lot of money, so my mom and I left at the time. My aunt offered to let us stay at her house until we got back on our feet. Now, my aunt lives in the countryside. It's miles of farmland and a few houses every now and then. Her neighborhood is small, but everyone keeps to themselves. The area my aunt lives in is called the Base. Apparently soldiers were housed there, and eventually died and were buried on that land. Don't know the exact history, though. Driving to her place at night is super creepy and confusing. You can easily get lost, so everyone aims to reach home before the sun sets. Now back to my story. My aunt had a second house, not too far away, where her family would go to do gardening and just chill out sometimes. My cousins and my aunt thought it would be a great idea to spend a night there. The house was an old, abandoned Baptist church converted to a house that my aunt had inherited. The previous owner was a seer woman and would do readings and even give exorcisms for people. My aunt took care of her when she was ill, therefore she gave the house to my aunt. The inside was run down, one couch for about 10 of us. Yeah, it was a big family. And a dirty bathroom with an annoying leaky pipe. Light barely entered the house during the day. It also gave an eerie vibe to it, because being in that house or on the land, it was always dead silent despite being surrounded by nature. That night, we all had these little rooms to sleep in, with there being so many of us that we had to share. My mom and I were in one room when I woke up to the sound of the wooden door being creaked open. I turned to see my mother upright, shaking, and obviously full of fear. No one came through the door, but you could hear these loud, heavy footsteps around and inside the house. It woke everyone up, so we all huddled in the living room. All of a sudden, the lights cut off. We lit some lamps, and my uncle was getting ready to check on the noise outside when a loud banging came at the front door. It was around 1 a.m., and this place was completely deserted. We all stood still and quiet, and then the banging grew even more violent. The door began to shake, and a guttural, demonic voice was asking to be let in. Panic and terror struck all of us. My younger cousins began to scream and cry because the voice was unnatural, pure evil. The adults sent us into one room and they formed a prayer circle in the middle of the living room. Everyone's backs were turned to the window, but I was the only one facing it, and I remember very clearly seeing a tall man with horns and a red aura looking back at me from outside. He was smiling at me, motioning me to come toward him. He had these long black fingernails that he began to scrape the window with. At this point, everyone could hear it, but by the time they turned to the window, he had vanished. However, all the doors started banging and the windows were rattling. We kids all ran out to the living room and joined the prayer circle, reciting the mantras from my religion, and then suddenly, it stopped. The sun was now peeking in. It was 6 a.m. Everything felt like an hour, but we couldn't account for the rest of the time that had passed. We stayed for a few months in my aunt's original house, without ever visiting that second house. My mom eventually got remarried, so we moved. It's been about 17 years or so since that incident, and we rarely visit my aunt, like maybe once or twice a year. Since then, however, the house has been demolished. My aunt has said that strange things occurred whenever she was on that land after that incident, and she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't handle it, and they eventually sold the land, too. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, "No, no, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and he immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the patient, the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. I can't get this experience out of my head, no matter how many years have passed. This happened way back in the early 2000s. I was in the 8th grade and we were on a trip. I stayed in a hotel with 2 other girls. One of them was my friend and another girl who we were just somewhat acquainted with. The first night in the room, during my shower, I felt like someone was behind me, like standing really close to my back under the shower spray. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. So I continued showering, but the feeling just got worse. When I finished my shower, I pulled open the curtain, and when I looked up at the gigantic wall mirror, I saw a grotesque face behind my right shoulder. It was gone within seconds. I think I stood frozen there for a whole minute before I practically ran out, screaming. The next day, we were getting ready to go out. The girl we roomed with said that someone was in our room last night. She heard the toilet flush, the sink turn on, but then nothing. No one entered the room. No one left. And no one else but us was in there to begin with. We know because we checked every nook and cranny after she told us. The second night, when we got back to our hotel room, I suddenly felt super sleepy, like I literally fell to the floor once I stepped inside. It was odd because I wasn't sleepy at all until we actually walked into the room. The other 2 couldn't move me since I had an extra 50 pounds on them, so they just covered me up with the blanket, put a pillow under my head, and left me there. Then my friend said that sometime during the night I had gotten up, used the bathroom, and crawled into the bed. But I don't remember doing that. In fact, when I woke up on the third day, I was still on the floor. My boyfriend and I decided to take an impromptu trip to Gettysburg and booked a decently priced hotel the night before. The first night I fell asleep no problem, but the second night, not so much. He had already gone to bed, and I had just shut the light off. As soon as the light was out, I could hear paper or bags shuffling around on our TV stand, and I thought that he had gotten up to look for something. I looked up, and of course no one was there, but I instantly felt terrified and felt the presence of someone standing at the foot of our bed. It only lasted about a minute or so, and then suddenly there was a loud bang, like a door being slammed in the room above us, and the feeling disappeared. When we got home, my boyfriend, who doesn't believe in the supernatural at all, extremely reluctantly brought up how the first night that we stayed, he got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and immediately got creeped out and thought that someone was in our room. He went into the bathroom and felt like someone was standing directly behind him. Of course, Gettysburg has tons of history, but after doing some research, I haven't found much information about the hotel or what may have been there before. Whatever happened in our room didn't feel harmless, though. When I was a child, my family often spent the weekends or the holidays at my grandmother's house. As a typical traditional Malay house, the house was made out of wood and was quite huge. Not a surprise, since my father does have a lot of siblings, 9 of them. It wasn't just my immediate family. Most weekends or holidays, even my uncles and aunt would be there too, along with their family. Sometimes there would be around 50 to 70 of us inside that house. It was truly one of my fondest memories, where the entire huge family would sit together to have dinner or celebrate birthdays or whatever. One day, my grandmother fell sick. The doctor simply told us that her health was deteriorating since she was quite old at the time, but that she required no hospitalization. My dad and his siblings all made up their mind that my grandmother should stay with them. Every month, she would stay with a different one of her children at their house. I remember she stayed the most at my house, since it was the biggest at that time. I was happy, since she was a great storyteller and a great cook. In the meantime, my father and uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately, her health continued to decline. She told my father that she wanted to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't like the idea with her being alone in that house, especially with her declining health. After much discussion, my eldest uncle decided to build a house directly in front of my grandmother's house for him to stay in. In the meantime, they would rent a nearby house so that he or my cousins could visit her every day. My father and his siblings also agreed to hire a nanny for my grandmother so that she would never be alone. Fortunately, despite no one having been staying in the house for about 2 years, it was relatively clean. It had been almost a week since my grandmother returned to her own home. The weekend was coming, and my father decided to bring back the tradition of staying at my grandmother's. That Friday night, around 2 of us were there, and that night strange things began to happen. The first to notice that something was off were my cousins. They were all the daughters of Dad's youngest sibling. They were always cheerful, but at that time I remember their faces almost always looking terrified. I chalked it up to them just being kids, which was ironic since I was only around 10 myself at that time. Then, as I walked past their bedroom, I heard through the thin wall that the girls complained to their parents that they had noticed a few shadowy figures, which had been all over the house. My uncle tried to convince them that it was just their imagination. I decided not to care much. I was too tired and sleepy. That night, while I was sleeping, I remember waking up and staring above and seeing something terrifying. Just so you know, a traditional Malay house rarely has a ceiling. The house beam was exposed, and you can see the inside layer of the roof. During my sudden awakening, I saw something like a shadow sitting on the house beam. I had to rub my eyes to see, and after a while I began to make out what it was. It was some sort of creature or something. Am I still dreaming? I thought to myself. I was utterly terrified. I could see the creature, but it was like my brain failed to see exactly how it looked. Sometimes it would look like a lion, then a crocodile, then a huge bird or some other kind of animal. And then it looked at me. All I could remember was its huge red eyes and a wide grin filled with fangs. I tried to scream, but my voice stuck in my throat, and my body felt stiff as if I were paralyzed. All I could do was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it, and force myself to go back to sleep, hoping that it was a nightmare. The next day, as I sat alone at the stairs, trying to get rid of the memories of what happened, from the corner of my eyes I could sense that someone or something had been peeking out from the toilet area looking at the living room. It appeared to be a child, or was the size of a child, with pale, gray skin. Another time I was sitting in a chair in the living room. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but it happened throughout the day and the night. That same child. Then I heard my aunts talking with each other. It turns out that I wasn't the only one who had noticed it. The entire family had seen it too. Or rather, we could only see it through the corner of our eyes. When we all turned to look at it directly, it disappeared. Some decided to check it out themselves, and yet nothing would ever be there. My uncle quietly told us that when a house was abandoned, there will always be something that will live there. That house had been abandoned for 2 years before, so obviously something had moved in, and we were all simply intruders. He told us that if we didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother us. That night we all prayed together, as well as recited some holy prayers. Yet I could still see the little stalker, and I could begin to notice a few shadows around the house that did not belong to the furniture or to the other people living there. Worse for me was at night. I woke up again, and this time the thing was already grinning at me with what I assumed a hand or finger poking at my cheek. It didn't feel solid at all. It felt more like a cloud of smoke. Again, I tried to scream, but my body felt stiff. Like before, I could only slowly pull my blanket to cover my head and force myself back to sleep. I never dare to sleep at that house ever again. Anytime we ever went back to my grandmother's house, during either weekends or holidays, I simply stayed at my uncle's house that was right in front of it. Yet every time I entered there, I could still sense the small figure poking its head out from the bathroom wall and the shadows that would be moving around. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then we never have had reason to stay at that house. Now, the house was downsized while I was at university, yet it still has the original layout of the lower area. They only actually got rid of the upper area. I asked my father why not simply demolish the entire building. He then told me that even getting rid of the upper area was difficult. Workers were pushed by nothing, and electronics and engines would always malfunction. In the end, they decided not to touch the bottom area and just continue to use it as storage. I've had a few unexplained experiences over the decades, but the Gold Hill Hotel is my favorite spooky tale. I was staying the weekend at the hotel with friends and my then boyfriend. It was a really memorable weekend because it was the Christmas holiday season and the hotel was decked out. We were all drinking and it was quite festive. There was a female jazz singer from San Francisco who was staying at the hotel and who played carols on the piano. My boyfriend went up to the room before me and passed out drunk in the bed. I followed not long after. Later that night, I awoke suddenly to someone jerking the blankets off of me. It was the force of the jerk on the blankets that woke me up. I immediately looked over at my snoring, drunk boyfriend sleeping on his side, and then down at the blankets themselves. They had been pulled down to my waist, and down off of him. I slowly pulled them back up and curled up next to him. I slept very little the rest of the night. The next day, I asked him if he recalled anything unusual, but he didn't, and poo-pooed my experience. Later, I found out that we were staying in one of the rooms that visitors commonly reported having blankets pulled off of them. I can't recall the specifics of the ghost that actually haunts the room, but I sure do remember that moment when the blankets were laying down below my waist and pulled off of my boyfriend, and realizing that maybe we weren't alone in our room. In 1996-97, I lived in a fairly old terraced house with a cemetery at the end of a road. Cliché, I know, but it's an important detail. Nothing remarkable about the house or the area, it was just convenient for college. Anyway, I was up late one night on the PC in my bedroom, which looked out onto the street. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. For whatever reason, probably to give my eyes a rest, I wandered over to the window and looked down at the road in the direction of the cemetery, although it was too far down the street for me to actually see. And I saw 3 people walking slowly down the road. I could see that they were quite old and appeared to be dressed in funeral clothes, which, given the hour, was weird. There were 2 women and a man. I'd put their ages at about 80, and the woman in the middle was being steadied or guided by the other woman and the man as they came closer. I got the impression that she was upset. My first thought was that given their age, she had recently buried her husband and grief had caused her to behave slightly irrationally. It was all interesting enough for me to carry on watching as they got closer to the house. Just outside the front door of the house was a street lamp. I continued to watch them as they made their way past, but when they got to the lamppost, they all stopped, and the upset woman in the middle looked up at me and grinned. This is where it got even weirder. The grin became a sort of grimace, and if there was any color in her face to start with, it was now dead white. At that point, I realized that I was staring right into her eyes, but her eyes were pitch black. If you've ever crashed a car, the final split second before you make impact seems to drag out as you process more information than normal in the time frame. It was that sort of scenario. I'm sure that we only made eye contact for a second, but it felt like several minutes as my peripheral vision faded and I felt like all I could see were those 2 black holes in her face drawing me in. The distance between us didn't change, but somehow it felt like she was coming closer. At that point, the 2 people with her were just continuing to look down the road as if they were frozen, but waiting for this woman to finish with whatever she was doing. I was suddenly hit with this intense feeling of dread and panic, so I threw myself to the floor. As soon as I had broken away from her gaze, I felt pretty stupid that this upset old woman, who clearly needed help, had spooked me so badly. I looked out the window again, and there was no sign of them. I should start by saying that I am sensitive, but have never known about or tried any of my abilities to sense the paranormal. I recently stayed at the Stanley Hotel in New York. After pulling onto the property, I immediately felt extremely uneasy and had a sense of dread. Just an overall bad feeling about the place. After entering the building, I started feeling nauseous and lightheaded like I was going to pass out, and weird stabbing pains were all around my head. Not a normal headache. As the night progressed, I started getting flashing images in my head depicting horrible, violent, graphic scenes of myself being stabbed and choked, and figures who were standing over me. I felt as if I weren't alone in my own head. I felt random bursts of anger and sadness and would want to either hurt the people that I was with or just start hysterically crying. I have never felt so out of control, like my head was in a fog, and everything that was happening was a dream, like I was there in my head, but I couldn't control my body. It has been 5 days since I left, and I still don't feel like myself. What happened to me in that hotel? About 2 years ago, my Nana brought home a Ouija board that she found at a yard sale. I have always been a true believer in the paranormal, and it's always been one of my peak interests. I have heard or read enough stories and watched enough shows to know not to mess around with a Ouija board, and quite frankly, they kind of freaked me out, so I wanted nothing to do with it. My Nana, on the other hand, doesn't believe in the paranormal whatsoever, and thought it would just be a fun game for myself, my brother, and the oldest of my 2 cousins. I left it on the dining room table for days before she made me put it away. I ended up sliding it under my bed in hopes of just forgetting about it. My brother, 11, and my cousin, 12, bugged me about it constantly because they wanted to play with it and I wouldn't let them. I tried to explain to them that it wasn't just a game and that it shouldn't be messed with, but they were preteen boys who couldn't help but do things that they shouldn't. One day after I got home from work, the boys were there and I had this sneaking suspicion that they played with it. I looked under my bed and it was there, but I just had this odd feeling. That's when I went downstairs and interrogated them about it. At first, of course, they denied it, but I saw right through them until they finally admitted that they had in fact played with the board. I asked them if they had said goodbye when they were done, and they claimed that they did. My cousin likes to over-exaggerate stories big time, and makes things up to be overly dramatic, so when he told me about a couple of things that supposedly happened, I didn't believe him at all. Also, they were boys who liked to mess with each other, so I assumed that's what was occurring. Anyways, a couple of nights later I got in bed, and as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I got this feeling like I was being watched. I looked over at my closet, which has 2 sliding doors, and I noticed one of the doors is slightly opened, leaving a small space. It creeped me out for some reason, so I turned and faced the other way, trying to ignore everything and just fall asleep. I finally passed out, and the next thing I know, I'm woken up by what felt like someone or something hitting me in the back of the head. I was lying on my back, so the back of my head was fully on my pillow, which made it even weirder. And it wasn't a light hit either. It scared me so bad. I was shaking. I look around my room and I don't see anything, but then all of a sudden I hear my floor creaking like someone is walking around my bed. After laying there for a good little while, I finally got the courage to get up and grab my phone and book it to my living room. I sat and tried to calm down. I could still feel a tingling, pulsating sensation at the back of my head. I turned on my phone and realized it was 3 in the morning. I called my boyfriend, now husband, with tears streaming down my face from being so freaked out. He didn't pick up, and I swear I called him another 15 to 20 times before I finally gave up. I sat in the chair until my Nana got up around 6. I didn't tell her what had happened, because I knew she wouldn't believe me and would say I was acting stupid. After she got up, I had breakfast and then called my boyfriend again, and he finally answered. He told me he had his phone on silent mode so that he didn't know that I had been calling. I gave him so much crap for this, let me tell you. I told him what had happened and he felt so bad and felt like an idiot. He told me he would have come over in a heartbeat to comfort me and was so apologetic. Later that day, he came over and we took the Ouija board to a junkyard to get rid of it. My husband is the only one in my family that knows what happened, and I didn't experience anything again after I got rid of the Ouija board. So once again, moral of the story, Ouija boards should not be messed with. To begin with, I should explain some basic personal history. Real names will not be revealed, obviously. I have a family of 5 plus 2 spouses. My parents, my 2 brothers, my oldest brother's wife, and mine. Before getting married and moving out with my wife, I lived in the same house for 19 years. My parents bought it when I was like 6 months old, and I got married during college, so I've only ever known that house and my current apartment. I had some traumatic experiences when I was very young that are tied to one of the rooms in my parents' house, and then a few years later, my parents had me move into that room. During my time in that room, I started having vicious nightmares, all involving me watching helplessly as the people that I loved were brutally murdered in graphic and creative ways, in which one constant fixture was a figure that seemed to be observing everything and watching me from a distance, never directly interacting with the chaos, but always on the edge of my vision. This figure always looked the same. A tall mass of complete opaque blackness, with the exception of an antlered animal skull where its head should be. Anyway, when I went to college, moving out of that room, the nightmares stopped completely. I didn't have a single one until I came home for winter break and stayed in that room again. During that break, my then fiancé stayed a few nights at my house with me. We slept in separate rooms, but both on the same floor. During the night, she texted me that she was having a panic attack and that she thought she was seeing a figure. When I asked what it looked like, she described the figure from my dreams exactly, and I told her to start reading Psalms in the hopes that it might help. She immediately felt better. Not sure if it was because of the scripture itself or if it was just a placebo, but I am a firm Christian, so I believe that it helped. We talked for a while about it before deciding to keep an eye out for more spooky shit. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. The next morning, I felt numb and out of commission, and I didn't fully recover until the next day. Every time I've gone back to that house since, I have felt an overwhelming, malicious presence there. It has the effect of weighing down on everything. It kind of feels like cotton in your ears, and making everything feel super depressing. Recently, there was another development. My grandfather passed away this last semester, and my grandmother moved into the house with my parents. She's a troubled person, and she brought a lot of toxicity and conflict to the home. Last time I was there with my wife, we immediately felt something horrifyingly evil. I've always had a sensitivity to spiritual things, and it was like nothing that I have felt before. I think that it was feeding off of the conflict in the house and making things worse. My cat, who we had brought with us, immediately slipped into what looked like a super depressive state. She wouldn't play or do anything, no matter how hard we tried. The kicker was the time that I decided to try something. I walked into my old room, the one tied to my traumatic experiences, and tried to feel for any sort of extra bad energy. It was tangible. My mom and I had repainted that room the last time I was down there, and it felt very cathartic, but the power was still ever present. On an instinct, I touched a wall in the room and immediately had violent visions reliving my trauma, except the spirit was there, watching and seemingly gloating. It felt like it was trying to rub what had happened in my face like a "look what I'm capable of" sort of thing. My wife told me that I went white as a sheet and began shaking and crying, but I don't remember it. It behooves me here to add that I have seen several therapists about my traumatic experience. I don't think it was a PTSD flashback, as I've mostly worked through everything and am pretty mentally stable now. I'm relatively certain that the presence in my childhood home is evil, even demonic. I've talked to my mom, and I get the sense that she doesn't really believe me, but my wife and I are pretty certain of it. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled, and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. This took place in the summer of 2010. I was with my family and we went down to the USA for vacation that year. We stayed at the hotel we normally stayed at, which was a Red Roof Inn. As we walked in, something felt off about the room, and I thought to myself that it must be just nothing. Over the next few nights, always around 3 in the morning, my mother and I would hear a knocking against the wall. At first we thought, oh, maybe it's just the people next door. However, the room was empty, and we thought nothing of it until it kept happening. I was wondering, could it possibly be haunted? My mother, being super into the paranormal and believing in this as I do myself, we decided to take a statue of the Archangel Michael from my dad's dashboard. It was super small, nothing big, and the next thing you know, we never heard the knocking for the rest of the trip. So it is possible that the room was haunted, and after doing some reading, we think that it could have been a poltergeist. Me and some friends went to an abandoned mental asylum at night, not really expecting much. We busted in through one of the boarded-up windows, and when we were inside, we all heard talking. We figured that other people were there, so we followed the sound. We were walking down the hall and heard a woman whispering, "Why did you take my baby?" over and over again. At this point, I was visibly shaking, and we all believed we found where the sound was coming from originally. We go to this room, and there was a huge cage. It looked like one of those pet carriers, only human-sized. I don't know what actually happened that night. I don't really believe that dead people were talking in there, but the sheer creepiness of it all was just too much. In October of 2018, I was hospitalized for 4 nights. I was put in the surgical wing due to lack of beds, and was in a 4-person room with all rooms near me having 4 people as well. The last night of my stay was on the 31st, which of course was Halloween. Other than it being noisy from the firecrackers outside, followed by the heavy rain, it was uneventful. I was particularly restless that night and not having an easy time falling asleep. Just before midnight, and I remember looking at the clock seeing 11:47 because I couldn't fall asleep. I saw a figure in the window next to my bed. It was a massive black dog, like a long-haired husky with the reddest eyes that I have ever seen. It was such a deep, but at the same time bright crimson. It was just staring at me, and I felt completely frozen. I turned over and covered my face, and when I looked over some time later, it was gone. I should note that I was on an upper floor with a roof landing outside my window, so no way could an animal have gotten up there. I ignored it, called the nurse, and asked for something to help me sleep. They told me I didn't need anything and would eventually sleep on my own. About half an hour later, I saw the same creature staring at me from inside a window within the hospital across from mine. I immediately felt sick and panicked, and as quick as I saw it, it was gone. Several minutes later, my wing went on lockdown. The doors all closed, and all I could hear were screams and nurses running. The screams and panic went on for 4 hours. I found out the next morning that a pregnant woman in the room next to mine had died from an adverse reaction to the medication that she had been given. She went into complete psychosis, and at one point was running through the halls, banging on everyone's doors, begging for help, and telling us that the nurses were trying to kill her. I will never get those sounds out of my head. I had no idea what hellhounds were until I got home and searched. For what I had seen. I've let it lay dormant in my brain since then, but recently I've been having dreams where they show up, and it's terrifying. I'm so lost as to what to make of it, and terrified to make any assumptions. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by, the door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. I've always been pretty sensitive, and so have quite a few people in my family. I've seen dark figures, recorded a few voices, but nothing too major before this story. It was my senior year of high school, and I had been going through a period of what some may like to call paranormal investigating with my friends. We were spending time visiting cemeteries and abandoned houses, like most teenagers do. Just having fun being scared. Well, my friend Tyler found this Ouija board in an abandoned house that he had explored a month or so back and asked me if I wanted it. You see, he knew I was into the paranormal with all the love I had for being scared. I liked scary movies, haunted houses, and anything to get the adrenaline going. So of course I said yes. My friends Alex, David, and I decided to skip school, and I asked them if they wanted to use this Ouija board with me. They were along for the ride, and we had planned to find a place to do this. My house. My house was already known to be haunted because due to some experiences that I had had in my basement. So it seemed like the appropriate choice. Now my friend David didn't believe in anything paranormal. No ghosts or any of that stuff. So he decided to film this for us. Alex is sitting across from me, and I have my hands on the eye by myself. I figured you weren't supposed to do this alone from what I had seen in movies, but we did it anyway, just to see what would happen. Alex begins to ask some questions. Basic ones at first, like, is there anyone here with us? What's your name? What do you want? Alex then asks, are you trying to hurt Chris? And nothing really happens in that moment, but I do remember this distinct chill run down my spine. I brushed it off. We decided to watch the video back on David's phone just to see what it looked like. As we're watching this back, when it comes to the question of, are you trying to hurt Chris? In the video, my head tilts back and I say yes, in two different voices. One in my own voice, and one in a deep, guttural voice. We all look at each other and exclaim, oh my God. You didn't say that. You didn't say anything. And needless to say, we got rid of that board and never really talked about it again. But that was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. I am currently sitting in my bed at 12:35 in my time zone right now and was watching a YouTube video a couple minutes ago. Without warning, I suddenly hear a scream. My first thought was that it was part of my video, but I checked and it was not. It sounded like it was from a man experiencing pure terror and agony. It was a single scream from the worst fear and pain imaginable that lasted 2 to 3 seconds, and then silence. My dog started barking once I heard it. It was hard to explain, but it didn't sound like anything a human was capable of making. More like a much more convincing sound from a horror movie. I have heard some weird sounds around the house, mainly in the kitchen and dining room, since I moved in. I'm pretty skeptical about things like this usually, but that was like nothing I have ever heard before. I was in Pennsylvania exploring an abandoned mill/factory that had been built in the 1800s at dusk. I was standing on a pile of limestone cinder blocks surrounded by tall grass and brush, with a tree line about an acre away, just after the sun had set, while my friends were inside still. As I was climbing down, I heard a low, guttural growl. Not like a dog's growl, or any type of animal for that matter. It was deep. It had much more bass to it. It was very disturbing and not like anything I have ever heard before. It sounded as if it were very close, but I didn't hear any brush moving. It freaked me out, and I booked it to my friend's house in the dark. I am on an extended stay at a hotel away from my home for military reasons. The first 2 weeks were fine, but now I've been waking up between 4 and 5 a.m. every night, feeling like someone is watching me from one specific side of the room. Last night it started around 10 p.m. and nearly kept me up all night. I only feel this at my hotel room, not when I go home on my off-duty days. I live on the second floor, so it can't be coming from the window. It is only one specific side of the room, which is a little unsettling. Last night it got so intense that what little sleep that I did get was with the light on. I have a history of sleep paralysis and other sleep issues, but this is something that I have never felt before. I have had multiple experiences with the unexplained and paranormal side of things, but this just seems different. Could this be my own paranoia?